Thank you for joining the Making Your Tech and Cyber Careers Flourish 2023. The idea behind this conference is to allow individuals to see the many different ways that you can progress your tech and cyber careers, and to talk to industry leaders like our keynote today, Will Lin, who has been working with multiple VCs, as well as an experienced investor and CEO himself. So he'll be sharing his experiences from the front lines. Will, pass it over to you.
Hello, everyone. Really nice to meet you. So I have some slides prepared, but the way I like to do things is, of course, like to have conversations. So feel free to send questions or comments within the chat or elsewhere, and I'm happy to sort of make this a back and forth kind of dynamic as well. Alrighty. Let us jump into the presentation prepared for you guys. All right, should we do full screen? All right, let's do it. All right, so purpose of this presentation, I love seeing patterns in the world, and I love careers. I love helping people coaching and mentoring folks. And so in my experience of doing quite a lot of coaching and mentoring, at least 50 people at this point, I have begun to see sort of patterns in sort of different careers, regardless of which space you're in, which role you're in, as well. One of the quick things I'd like to do, of course, is to, for the folks who don't know me, give you a bit of a sense in terms of all the different things I'm up to as well, and then a little bit about my background, so you know where I'm coming from. So first of all, I'm a first-generation immigrant. In fact, I came here without my parents, so I lived without my parents starting when I was 5. And that meant I had to figure a lot of things out on the fly. That naturally led me to become more of a tinkerer. That naturally led me to look for more ways of finding help beyond my parents. So that was mentorship, that was reading, and then to help afford sort of the things I wanted to do, it also pushed me into being an entrepreneur at a very young age, because I was thinking about how do I pay for college, that kind of dynamic as well. And that, of course, in the end, naturally led me to becoming a venture capitalist for the last decade. I studied at university at Berkeley. That was my first exposure to California, actually, and then I've been in California since. As one, my wife, who I met in college, is based out here, and then two, because my focus on technology and venture capital, the Bay Area has been the perfect place for me to hang out. And my whole career at this point, since I knew I wanted to be in business and finance and technology, since I was at a very young age, I've been lucky to be able to start careers both in investment banking and in venture capital since I graduated. In terms of extracurriculars, I think a lot about myself at my young age, not having the help that I wish I did, and having to go out and seek the kindness of strangers. And so as a result, I hope to be that stranger that helps others as well. And so that's what's led to writing quite a bit on LinkedIn. That's the best place to follow me and stay in touch by far, as well as writing this book called The VC Field Guide, which will be out in May. It's meant as well as writing articles on Security Week and dark reading. And then finally, also the catalyst to starting a company. As the company grows, that'll give me the opportunity to help provide careers to others as well, as the company is successful. Really quickly, going back to the book, common question people hear when they hear about the VC Field Guide is like, oh, I've never been in VC. I don't know a lot about VC. I don't have any friends in VC. This book is meant for people who aren't in VC, so that they can see it's a fundamentals book. And so if you have any interest in it whatsoever, feel free to pre-order it. It'll be out in May. All right, moving on to the content. So there are a couple of things that I wanted to set with the content, which is really like breaking down really complex problems and conversations and categories into its multiple different pieces. And so with this slide, the intent here is to demonstrate and show what typically happens when a new technology is adopted within a company. And this conference is both focused on technology, which was new for a period of time with the advent of computers, of course, personal computing. And then cybersecurity is also still new, also still maturing, because there's still a lot for us to figure out in terms of how do we adequately and effectively protect our organizations. So I thought what would be helpful is, and the reality is that there's going to be a next iteration of technology. There's going to be micro iterations as well within technology as well. For instance, one new responsibility that popped up over the past decade or so was a lot of focus around product security, application security, for example. And that role had to evolve in this way throughout the industry. Now with cloud technology, that role, that responsibility is evolving in this way. Securing cloud technology is evolving in this way. And so I think it's really helpful to be able to see this, because if you want to be at the forefront, or you happen to be at a forefront of a new technology, it's good to know what are these different moving pieces. What are these new responsibilities that are created? How do they get created? And then what's next? The left side is really focused on sort of more internal responsibilities within an organization. If you are if you're working for a company and you're taking on responsibilities, how does those responsibilities evolve? And then also on this right side is more external centric. How do you outsource these responsibilities? How do you work with external vendors to be able to automate these responsibilities, to be able to make them more effective versus manually hand doing everything, for example, as well. So I'll go through each of these just so that we can make sure to talk about each of the nuances as a group, and just to give you a sense in terms of how have these new responsibilities and what do they typically look like when they evolve. So starting with number one, internal responsibilities. And I think talking about cybersecurity, talking about IT security is a really good way of looking at this as well. A lot of people who first got into security, when you ask a lot of them today, CISOs, how did you first get into security? So many of them started in IT. And the reality is today as well, some organizations, especially the smaller ones, where they can't have a full-time security lead, they ask their IT person to take partial responsibility for cybersecurity as well. That's the same across every single responsibility or skill. If a company doesn't have enough resources to have dedicated people, then they'll find people internally to take them on part-time. Then the next step is, as that responsibility grows in importance, as a responsibility grows in terms of work that's required to be done, that's when it evolves into becoming a full-time job, starting with one person doing that job internally, and then eventually evolving into a team doing that internally as well. This is one where there is always room for surprise. I think when cybersecurity as a responsibility first came out, I think it wasn't that easy to imagine that we would require a full-time person dedicated to this responsibility. It wasn't that easy to imagine that now we would have the CISO and some organizations having 100 people cybersecurity teams as well. It wasn't that easy to imagine that we'd be breaking out those responsibilities into multiple smaller pieces as well. And so that's one thing to be mindful of as well, is when these new roles and responsibilities come up, and if you either happen to be doing it, or you're interested in doing it, or you're considering whether or not you should do it, I think one of the really important things to be mindful of here is you could be surprised, just like we're surprised by the size of the cybersecurity industry today. $200 million being spent with companies on the right. So flipping to external really quickly, consulting is a really great way to focus on a responsibility, especially if you want to do that full time. So for instance, let's stay with the trend cybersecurity. When it was first came out, sure, maybe they might have had someone work on that responsibility part-time. And perhaps some organizations, they didn't feel the need, nor did they have the people internally to take on that part-time responsibility. So that's when they start going to consultants and saying, hey, I want a quarter of a person dedicated towards this. You, dear consulting company, are managing multiple customers. Give me about a quarter's worth of expertise, and I'll give you about a quarter to or more's worth of compensation to be my vendor for that as well. That's usually how it starts, and then over time it evolves to, okay, I don't just want someone to be doing this for a quarter of the time. I want the best of the best to figure this out, because it's really hard to find that expertise, or we can't afford to have that expertise full time within the organization as well. And then eventually it also evolves to we can't hire the people fast enough. It's just the people are coming, they're joining, they're being trained, they're learning, they're growing, but then they're moving on to another organization because another organization is doing this, that, and the other, because this responsibility isn't as interesting anymore. For instance, a fun one is like talking about mainframe computing and engineers. Who still is excited to learn about COBOL, for example. And so as a result, you do have to resort to working with consultants to do those kinds of things as well, because only they have the expertise, and you couldn't. There aren't that many of them, and it's also and because there aren't that many of them, it's unbelievably expensive to try to ask one of them to join you full time, and then to also feel confident that they'll stay with you full time as well. And that is an opportunity. I mean, I think if you wanted to sort of play with scarcity value, being a big fish in a small pond kind of dynamic as well, I think that's definitely something really worth considering as a career path. And I think the most realistic place to hang out is as a consultant for those kinds of things. All right, now moving back towards internal, where we start talking around companies sort of having these responsibilities and sort of wanting to start creating more automation, make it more programmatic. This is when we start leveraging the power of development, of no-code, low-code, no-code kind of tooling. If this, then that kind of dynamic as well. This is when we sort of start figuring out, okay, how do we reduce the amount of manual clicking and moving and scrubbing and an analysis that someone might do as well. And this is something that generally, I would say, especially in the earliest stages when there aren't that many vendors doing this already. Generally, a lot of these kinds of projects get started because as science projects, as saying, hey, we need to hire yet another person to do this. We need to hire yet another person to do this. People are overloaded. You know, we need this. This is not sustainable. Let's try to find something to help alleviate the pain in a more cost-effective, efficient way. And that's what leads to some internal development as well. It requires thoughtfulness, it requires proactiveness, it requires budget, it requires a leader to go find the budget and to convince the constituents inside to do it. Or it requires something like living off the land kind of dynamic, right? Where someone just builds it with their own free time, nights and weekends kind of dynamic, as a favor to their team and to their organization. Of course, that evolves, that changes once we start having now vendors, right? Vendors, when it gets to a point now where, why do vendors exist? They exist because enough customers have the exact same problem or very, very similar problems, and they want a very, very similar solution. And that's when a vendor can start more cost effectively creating solutions for the ecosystem, instead of each company getting the budget and getting the momentum going and then actually building these products themselves that may or may not be successful. Sometimes it's much more efficient to go work with a vendor who's serving multiple customers that are solving the similar problems and with the similar solution as well. And then becomes an ROI statement when you start working with a vendor as well. And as the vendor ecosystem grows, it changes the dynamic quite a bit as well. In fact, sometimes there are some organizations where development is never a possibility. They are not an engineering first culture, and they can't be an engineering first culture. Perhaps they are an industry that they've never hired engineers in the past before. So they do have to work with vendors. And so vendors do start then creating a market, creating an opportunity for companies that, or for organizations that have a problem, but never had a solution for that problem as well, which the vendor can help fill in, which is a great help for the ecosystem as well. I really like talking about vendors in the perspective of a grocery store, actually. And I think a lot of us, we go to grocery stores to buy ingredients to make things. But let's say you wanted an exotic ingredient and it wasn't in the grocery store. The reality is you can't make that, you can't make what you want to do without that exotic ingredient. And similarly, let's say that you were exposed to something new in the grocery store that you didn't even know you wanted until you saw it as well. I think that's the dynamic that is there with vendors as well. Granted, there are also negative examples of this. So for instance, let's say a grocery store offered you 20 different copies or versions of an orange. That's not useful. That's not productive. Because you already know you don't need more than two. Maybe you don't need more than one option when it comes to oranges. Or perhaps this grocery store offers you an ingredient that makes 0 sense. It's bitter, it's weird, it takes a lot of effort to use and to turn into a dish. Not productive, not useful, doesn't make sense. And so there's both sides of the coin to that as well. All right, now flipping back to internal. So we have people doing things with internally with responsibilities. We're getting to this point now where there's a little bit more automation, there's a little bit more programmatic components, the whole people process technology, we sort of have each of those components. That's when, around this time or even before this time, that's when management starts becoming more required as well. We talked about this a little bit with internal development. Management is a whole nother beast. I always view management as a role where you're sort of battling politics internally within every organization. It's just the reality. We're not robots where we are, omnipresent and can, easily update each other in terms of what's going on and think all the same way. We all think differently. We all take time to digest information in our own way. We all need to digest it. It takes time for that information to flow as well. And so what that creates is politics. And what great management does is enables and shields their team from those politics, but someone has to do it. And so the best way to measure sort of what's really critical about a manager is their probability of in two ways. One is, do people trust that projects that this manager is responsible for will be successful, number one. And then number two, internally to their team, are they shielding their team from the politics that are just naturally present within every organization? This is a hard role. I think there's some insane statistic how almost every single project fails, or so many projects fail as well. And this naturally leads to going back to external, going back to number 6, talking about audit and compliance. Audit and compliance, painful to deal with because they're there to basically double check your work, and they don't exactly know what's going on within your organization. They don't know the politics that you know within your organization. They don't know the business priorities that you know within your company as well. But what they are tasked to do is to apply consistent frameworks on top of their clients to be able to double check their work more or less. And this is what leads to assessments. This is what leads to findings. This is what those kinds of dynamics. I think for me, when I see an industry that has audit compliance, I actually view it as a positive. I view it as a sign of a maturing organization, maturing industry, because without audit compliance, and we'll talk about this in a later slide, you can't create an executive role, and you'll see that in a little bit. All right. Moving on. So where are we, and what does that mean after we've achieved audit compliance sort of stage? What happens after that, for instance, with technology?
Well, before you jump on to this section, there was a question with regards to becoming an entrepreneur, and what are some of the steps one should take before taking that leap?
It is great question. It is a very big question. I would say that if I were to give one quick answer super fast, I would really emphasize spending a lot of time thinking about revenue first versus idea first. I think a lot of entrepreneurs, when they branch out, they think about the idea, what they could create, the value, the product, the service, the solution, whatever it might be. And but one of the most difficult things as a startup and as a vendor is revenue, is sales. And so I fully recommend always thinking about revenue first. What is a realistic revenue? How could you realistically generate revenue as an entrepreneur? So one really fun example was one of my portfolio companies, Bishop Fox. They actually started out by spinning out from their prior jobs, where their prior job was their first client at their startup as well. It is a unique situation. It doesn't always happen. Not every company is willing to let an employee move on to start their own company and then become a customer of that company as well. And I think what enables that is a little bit of scarcity value as well as a whole bunch of trust. Saying, okay, instead of hiring people to replace these folks that are moving on, I'll become a customer. So I will essentially still get the value and the work that I get from them at a set price that I'm familiar with and comfortable with as well.
Thank you.
Of course. All right. And so what's next, right? I mean, I think one of the really fun things about technology is that, yes, I just talked about new responsibilities and new categories being created, and then subcategories that get created within these mega categories as well. And so the reality is, I think the other big thing I think is really fun to notice, and I think this is an emerging insight. I won't say this is a defined insight yet. And so I'll verbally talk about it. I didn't put it down on the slide. But I do think that when I mean several decades. I actually mean every generation. I think every generation takes these problems, takes these responsibilities, and then reshapes it, because that new generation has different technologies, different problems, different preferences in terms of how they think about things as well. And it turns into a reimagining of an existing category. And so that's what leads to, for instance, before IT security, now becoming cybersecurity. And then a lot of people thinking that cybersecurity will just become security in the future. And then, of course, the waterfall development, agile development sort of transition as well. That also aligns really well with the generational change. And so I think that's something to think about, as well as while one, there is the creation of new categories, creation of new responsibilities, creation of skills and specializations on one side. And then two, there's the re-evolution of those things as each generation sort of becomes sort of leaders within their organization as well, and decision makers within their organizations. And so, but that doesn't mean if you, for instance, are part of the prior generation, you're SOL. It means that you can start thinking about it. Okay, the next generation is thinking about this. I have all this expertise of, I know what worked well in my generation. Let me generate empathy for this newer generation and find, how do I connect the dots between the two as well. And I think that gives you actually an unfair advantage versus the new generation as a result. All right. Now, the next thing I actually take a quick pause. Any question? All good? All right, perfect. Moving to the next one. So this aligns well to the question around what should I do if I want to start a new company? I think that a lot of people are very interested in the world of startups. What do they mean? Should I be a part of it? Should I be a customer of a startup? What's the experience like? And so before we do that, what I really want to do is show how new technology also generates a new group of startups as well. And then similar situation, we have the macro changes, right? So for instance, let's say a big macro change in technology is SaaS solutions, or another big macro change is the use of public cloud as well. What happened as part of all those sort of macro changes is that it reimagined prior solutions and also created the need for skills that didn't exist before, and the need for startups that didn't exist before as well. So one example I like talking about, for instance, is let's use the public cloud example, because we're still in the middle of it. We're I don't know, where are we? Probably like here-ish, maybe, around usage of public cloud, especially both in terms of the usage of public cloud as well as the securing public cloud, probably somewhere around here. So let's go through each of the examples. So consulting companies, use of public cloud. I think when we first really got started, a lot of the industry was actively tracking companies that went head on into public cloud. One example I think is very clear on the entertainment side. Netflix went full into public cloud in terms of their shift. On the banking side, Capital One had a lot of credibility or buzz as well as moving fully into public cloud. And then, of course, we had a lot of companies that were born in public cloud as well, like Uber, Airbnb, etc., Twitter. And so, but what did that mean first? First of all, if you were a company that wanted to shift into it, and remember going back here real quick, when we talk about companies that went straight into public cloud without they were doing this, they went straight into this. And then what we're talking about now is here, talking about consulting, vendors, audit, compliance. So there were some organizations that they weren't willing to ask someone to say, hey, you're doing IT, go figure out cloud for us. You're an engineer, go figure out cloud for us. Instead, they said, you know what? I prefer to hire a consultant who has expertise here. And so I don't learn by doing, I learn by hiring expertise. Really viable model. And so what that enabled is eventually enabled creating consulting companies that just did that, just help companies move into public cloud that wanted to do it. They wanted someone to help them do it. They also led to strategic consulting engagements, like management consulting, like the classic Big Four, McKinsey, like Accenture, Bain, that kind of dynamic as well. Gave them a lot of job work to do in terms of helping organizations move to the public cloud. Almost always it starts here, because building a product company, I'll talk about that in a little bit. Starts here, expertise, I'm hiring expertise externally. Next is talking about product companies. What generally happens when we're adopting new technology is that we actually hope that the new technology can do everything for us. They're the experts, right? AWS is the expert of AWS. So if I have this problem, for instance, a security problem or a DLP problem or a networking problem with AWS, I hope that AWS does it for me. And so what first happens is it continues supporting the consulting companies, right? Because these consulting companies then can become the experts of AWS, for example, and say, oh, we are an AWS specialist. We know everything there is about AWS. We are a premier partner of AWS, that kind of thing. Eventually, though, services consulting doesn't scale. Very, very, very expensive. There's not enough people doing it. And it's also not automated. It's not repeatable as well. It really depends on who you're working with, because with services, it really depends on who's actually delivering the services for you, for example. And then the second other thing that's really important to note is that it just doesn't, it's not cost effective. That person's not within your organization creating the automation and the processes that you do need. And that's what leads to product companies. Product companies that are solving these problems, they're essentially cheat sheets. So instead of someone doing your homework for you, this is someone giving you a cheat sheet so that you can do your own homework a lot faster and a lot easier as well. And then these cheat sheets evolving into, they're basically taking a test for you. Kind of dynamic, right? Because they're providing you an automated product as well. It's really important, really necessary. There is a little, because what you can do then is, instead of needing to build expertise yourself, you can purchase a product solution. But there's a caveat. A product solution is not a silver bullet. What leads to next then is an implementation. So at some point, everyone says, you know what, this product is the best solution this is the best cheat sheet for AWS, for example, or a problem within AWS. But the next thing, though, is then you have to implement it. You have to fill in that cheat sheet, and you have to fill in the cheat sheet with information that's relevant to your organization. But again, if you don't have the talent, that's when you hire implementation companies to do it for you. In one way, for instance, it's not efficient for you to become the expert of AWS and Azure and GCP. It's more efficient for you to understand how the business priorities could work well in a public cloud environment. So then you hire an implementation company to help you implement these products as well. Becomes a very large business depending on how difficult the product is and how difficult the problem is. For instance, I invested in a ServiceNow implementation company that grew exponentially because ServiceNow was becoming the dominant platform in IT asset management and IT service management as well. But IT, very, very complicated, very, very difficult. You had also legacy systems to migrate onto ServiceNow as well. Turned into a really interesting business, and made a lot of sense as well. Now, next is moving towards the product side again. What happens after that? Well, after that, that's when people start looking for platforms. They say, okay, I have 5 different companies all doing public cloud security for me in different ways. One is doing data, one is doing identity, one is doing logging, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I really would like a platform that does it all for me so that I don't have to manage multiple different solutions. So that's when we start seeing, for instance, consolidation within industries where companies buy others. And that's when we also start seeing, for instance, companies that come straight out of the gate wanting to build a platform business because it's more efficient to do it that way as well. These platform companies also tie in implementation depending on how complicated it is. But I think the dream is for platform companies to be more effective, more efficient, because they're so far behind here right there. They've had years and years and years to sort of find what can be even more automated as well. And so that hopefully requires less implementation than before. All right. And then that leads to the next one, which is, okay, you have a platform, it's doing what you want it to do. But even then, now we have results coming out of the platform companies that we need to be monitoring or thinking about and reacting to. And that's what leads to a product support company as well. This is the services version of it. Some companies, some platform companies and product companies also provide the support, whether it's called customer success or product support or managed services, that kind of dynamic as well. Then some other companies also provide the product support separately. And this is maintenance. And then you can sort of think about it in different ways as well. Consulting, one-time thing, very strategic, very, very early, doesn't always lead to results because it is sort of figuring out if you're ready for this new technology. Implementation, you know you're ready for the new technology, now you have to implement it. You have to make it work. And so it is work, it's time. And by the time the implementation is done, this product should work. They should be able to hand it off to the customer and to manage it themselves. But if they can't, then that's when you have, or if they can't, or they think it's more efficient to let someone else do it, that's what leads to product support. And so this is the maintenance version of it, and this is recurring and continues to go from there. Now, lastly, we move towards the conglomerate that does everything and anything. And one example that I think we can think about is, for instance, Cisco, where they provide multiple different features, services, support. They tie into everything, anything and everything for you. And I think this is a good measure of an industry fully maturing as well. Like I said before, public cloud probably still here. We still have a lot more to do here, still a lot more to do here before we get to a conglomerate in public cloud. All right, so let's reapply that to something we talked about before, which is what happens. Similar every several decades. Similarly, I believe it is related to generational changes in talent. Because the problem solved, but they're not going to stay the leader forever as well. And so that's when we see companies these are all classic examples that we all know. They're all public businesses. And the reality is these companies will get disrupted again, right? As the next generation comes up, they will find ways to do what these companies do well, but better for the next generation. Another alternative is these companies evolving themselves to be good, suitable companies for the next generation. It is very hard though. Sometimes it requires cutting off your own leg so you can grow another leg. And that's very, very difficult to predict when you need to do that, if you need to do that, how you need to do that. Very, very difficult to predict. And so as a result, it's not a foregone prophecy that these companies won't be around 10 multiple decades from now, but it is something it is difficult and will require a lot of leadership from the organization, as well as endurance to tell the market that they're going to cut off their own one leg that's very, very profitable for them to do another one. A great example of this is the iPod and iPhone. That creating the iPhone and marketing the iPhone cut into the iPod business for Apple. It quite significantly when the iPod business was extremely successful, extremely profitable for Apple as well. But ultimately, it turned into now Apple's largest business. Is the reason why Apple is worth in the trillions. All right, now I'd like to shift the direction really quick. So I know there's some chats, so I'll take a quick pause, and then we'll move forward to another sort of version of this conversation. All right, next version of the conversation. So where are we now? I mentioned that before. We are in the re-evolution of technology. We're in the re-evolution of security, because we are the next generation, the millennials specifically, are becoming more and more leaders within their organizations. We're now seeing more and more millennials being CISOs and CIOs of Fortune 200 companies. And at some point, millennials will be the CISOs and CIOs of all Fortune, or vast majority of Fortune 200 companies. And so there's a big shift going on right now. And so what does that mean to you? Next slide. This version of the conversation, the key purpose of this conversation is to talk about patterns that will exist and continue throughout time, regardless of which generation is leaders, regardless of what technology is prevalent. And so I, of course, can talk about what's going on right now within security or technology and what you could do at each of these levels. But I really want everyone in this group here to walk away with expertise that is relevant or advice that's relevant regardless of what's going on right now. And so I'll go through these 6 sort of levels within an organization and talk about sort of really what I think is the key work you need to do in order to progress to the next level as well. And so let's start with the entry level conversation. I think the most important thing in entry level, research, read books, mentorship, whatever it might be. This is a really great place to learn the fundamentals of the space that you want to be in. Because by knowing the fundamentals, and you don't have to understand the fundamentals, you don't have to be an expert of the fundamentals. All you need to do is just to know what the fundamentals are. So for instance, in security, there's the SOC analyst role, there's the AppSec role, there is the network role, there's the cloud role, there's these roles, right? And so it's good to know what each of them are, and then start comparing them to yourselves, both in terms of which ones are you most interested in, are you most naturally going to be enjoyed to do the most as well, and your existing skills, your existing story, really, really critical. How does your story translate to this role that you're looking for? So for instance, if you're in customer success, perhaps it's a lot easier to talk about doing a customer's this next role where you are good at dealing with difficult situations. And so perhaps you can become a project manager. Perhaps you can be a SOC analyst, something that is facing, that leverages a role, that's a skill that you already do have and that people are comfortable saying that you do have towards this next one. Research. All right, expert level. Next one is you got to be known for being good at what you're doing, but more specifically, you actually have to be good. You actually have to be an expert at it. This requires execution. There's no better learning than doing. You can read, that will help you do better, that'll help you execute better, but at the end of the day, you have to execute in order to become an expert. And so that requires time, that requires opportunity. Execute, you'll become an expert. Next one, 2 directions you can go. You could either want to become a manager, or you could choose to become even more of an expert in this space here. And let's say that you love AppSec and you can never see yourself doing anything about other than AppSec. GRC, oh my gosh, horrible. I never want to touch GRC ever, that kind of dynamic. Or the other way around, managing people. I never want to manage people ever because there's so many politics to deal with. I think the expert level is a really great place to start playing with consulting, where you can start, instead of being the expert within your own organization doing one skill, you can become an expert by working with multiple different organizations. And that makes you an even bigger expert, because not only can you apply these skills across one, you can apply them across 20. And once you apply them across a certain number, you know how to apply them across any number of organizations as well. And one example of that, from my personal experience, is career coaching. I did a lot of career coaching for a certain number of people. Eventually turned into a point where I knew how to be a career coach for any CISO, even though I've never been a CISO ever in my life. But because I had both the quantity and the quality and the execution, it turned me into someone that I had the ability to be able to be a CISO, a career coach, CISO mentor, despite never being a CISO ever. So next one, moving on, is self-awareness. So let's move back to the manager track, which is a classic one. If you stay within one organization for a period of time, you want to become a manager and then eventually an executive. I think the most important thing of the manager, when you get this opportunity, is to work on self-awareness. Very different role. When you are being managed to when you're becoming a manager, you see the world completely differently. And it's really important to have this self-awareness, to know that, because that enables you to become a better manager as well. Empathy, super critical to becoming a great manager. I think work on self-awareness, I think, is a really great place to focus on. Now you're a manager, and you're managing more people, and eventually you become a manager of managers as well. The only way to do that: execution, self-awareness, research, and then adding in there references. People who have had great experience working with you, who felt empowered while you were managing them as well. Really, really critical responsibility, and that's what will enable you to move towards middle management. Lastly, next, vice president, which vice president for me is sort of the role before the executive role. And that's where I think here it's really important to have clarity. The difficulty with a lot of folks who want to become an executive is that they want to start taking on responsibilities across multiple different areas. So, I want to be the VP of AppSec and the VP of Identity and the VP of GRC. And you can, but you have to first become a really good VP of something, and then be given the opportunity to become the VP of these other responsibilities as well. Now, then the next one, becoming an executive, CISO, any C-level role, any executive role, patience. The key thing here is that these executive roles don't pop up very often. They don't, it's not predictable. You can't, you have to essentially wait for those opportunities to open up to be considered for those roles. Requires a lot of patience. One way you can sort of help a little bit is by, of course, recruiting and meeting other companies, potentially filling that executive role at those organizations as well. But even then, requires patience. Things don't always come exactly as you expect. All righty, I think I'm pretty close to my time, actually, and I have like a lot more slides. So, but I think this is a really good place to pause and yeah, thank the audience for your attention and for your interest in hearing me talk and share sort of lessons learned in terms of how you can sort of predict sort of responsibilities being created by technology, how you can predict organizations and skills and opportunities that are created by it as well, and then how you can also work on yourself as you start creating these promotions for yourself as well. Best place to track me, I mentioned this before, LinkedIn. I write about this kind of stuff all the time, and I'm happy to continue sharing any knowledge and thoughts and learnings with the ecosystem.
Well, thank you very much for your talk today. Really appreciate it. We'll have continued discussions in our Vicious Vineyards Discord for those that are interested. In the meantime, we're going to take a networking break until 12 o'clock. Allow everyone to have some self-care in between sessions. And thank you so much for coming on today, Will. We really appreciate it.
Of course. See you, everyone.